We're going to start way back in 1876 when the first institution for, at the time, who were called feeble-minded people, and I use air quotes there because that's not the language, obviously, that we use today, for people who are labeled with intellectual disabilities. This was the first institution in Canada built for that specific purpose. 1876, and it was seen as progressive at the time because it was seen as progressive that the government was deciding to move people, to separate different groups of people who needed care and putting them into separate institutions. So this was seen as a progressive move at the time. It was publicly funded by the government. And the name of it, the buildings are still there outside of Orillia, Ontario. And the most recent name for this building is the Huronia Regional Centre, which some of you I know are familiar with. When it was opened, I think it was called the Orillia Asylum for
Idiots.
For idiots. Thank you, Harold. Yeah, so some language that we don't use anymore, but the Orillia Asylum for Idiots was its original name. So you can see how grand it was. Took up a lot of land right on the shores of Lake Simcoe. So that's a more recent picture of what it looked like just before it closed. And you can see there, it's on the shores of Lake Simcoe. So Huronia was open from 1876 until 2009, which is a really long time. Like, I guess that's almost over 140 years. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about why it took so long to close it down. But that's a very, very long history. So March 31st, 2009 was when all the institutions for people with intellectual disabilities finally closed. So it's recent, like this is in our recent history that these were still open. So I just have a few pictures now of what the interior looked like, and these photos are a little dated. The institution would not have looked exactly like this right when it closed. However, they're not that old, like they might be a couple of decades old, sort of the latter part of the 20th century. So this is the inside of what an institution would have looked like. This is a picture of the laundry room. And you can just see, first of all, the number of ironing boards that there are, which reflects how big the place was. When it was at its peak, there were a few thousand people living inside Huronia. And that was just one of 3 huge institutions in Ontario. So there were thousands of people incarcerated in institutions for people labeled with intellectual disabilities. So that shows the size of it. But the reason I put in a picture of the laundry also is that particularly at institutions for people with intellectual disabilities, people who lived there were made to work to maintain the institution. People on the panel have spoken to me about doing laundry in the institution. There were all kinds of things that people did to maintain the institution without being paid. So it was labor that people who were incarcerated were being forced to do without payment, but ironically increased their own incarceration, right? Kept the institution going, wall building, things like that kept the building going, even though they had no choice about whether or not they did that work. So, so this is a picture of the laundry room where many residents of Huronia had to work. This is just a more recent picture of people making their beds. And what you notice, of course, is how crowded it is. How many people were crammed into these buildings. So this is a picture of Rideau Regional Center. And you can see it's huge. This was one of the 3 really large institutions that were built in Ontario. This was near Smiths Falls, which is not too far from Ottawa. And this was built, I think the year is 61, or it was sometime around the late 1950s, early 1960s.
Before that.
And what's interesting, was it in the 50s?
It's in the 50s.
In the late 50s?
Early
50s. Okay, so in the 50s. What's interesting about this is that by the 1950s, there was already a relatively well-formed parents' association. So parents were starting to agitate for more services from the provincial government for their children with intellectual disabilities. And they were starting to agitate to close down institutions. So even in the midst of this climate of civil rights starting, the civil rights movement in the United States, the women's movement, and the Parents Association is getting very strong here. Still, the government built this huge, massive institution near Ottawa. It's so big that you could apparently walk down a huge hallway right down the middle, and it was more than a quarter of a mile long. Like this was a really, really big place. And the reason the government decided to open this and another one that I'm going to show you in a moment is because Huronia was too crowded. So they had this overflow. And they decided the best way to address that was, rather than starting to dismantle Huronia and start to increase supports to the communities, instead they just built more institutions. So this was a really strange response in many ways. Besides these big ones, they also built 16 smaller ones around the province. So it was just this continuation of absorbing the overflow of Huronia instead of starting to shut them down. And this is also despite a report in 1971, which was really sad, by Walter Williston did this report. And this was in 71, and he said, we have to shut these institutions down. It was also following a couple of tragedies based out of this institution. A couple of men who actually had been placed outside of the institution on some kind of fostering program where they were with a family doing work. One of them actually took his own life, and another one tried to escape and got severe frostbite. After these two terrible incidents, Walter Williston was saying, we have to shut this place down. That was 1971. It didn't finally happen until 2009. So it took a very, very long time. Okay, that's a picture from inside Rideau, the dining hall. It's not a very good photo, but again, it just shows the crowding, how many people actually live there. And this is a photo of the third large institution near Chatham, which was called the Southwest Regional Center when it closed. And behind it, you can just sort of make out barely in the light there, that's Lake Erie. Another very large institution, sprawling. Okay, so just to show you a map, if you see the middle of the map, the point of the triangle is where Aurelia would have been, the Huronia Regional Center. The point on the right would be the one in Smiths Falls, and the one on the left would be the one near Chatham, the Southwest Regional Center. The reason I show that is just to kind of show you that it actually covered the most populated part of Ontario. So the government was pretty intentional in their placement of these institutions. They had the most populous areas covered with these three very large institutions. This is a picture of gravestones at Huronia. It's a very sad photo. As you can see, there's just numbers on them. There are no names. This is the way that people were buried at Huronia when they passed away there. They were buried with numbers on their gravestones, not names. There's a very sad story about this graveyard in that at one point in its history, the stones were dug up and used to build a pathway. So they were just taken out of the cemetery and used to build a pathway, which is really a horrible way to disrespect people's lives once they've deceased, right? And then a chaplain a few decades later found out what was going on and dug them up and had them moved back. However, there's this tragic side to the story that the numbers and the names are still not connected for the most part. And there's a very important project going on right now called Remember Every Name, where a dedicated group of volunteers are trying to match up the numbers with names of people who lived there. So it's a very, very sad part of Huronia's history, and I know that some of our panelists will probably speak about it when it's their turn to talk about what's going on these days at the cemetery. So just to bring you up to the present, if any of you were aware a few years ago, these two women, Marie Slark on the left in the purple and Patricia Seth on the right in the white shirt, were the principal litigants in the class action lawsuit against the Ontario government in 2012. So what Patricia and Marie did was, with their litigious guardians, they launched a class action lawsuit against the Ontario government. They were former residents at Huronia, and they said we were abused and treated very badly there. So they launched a class action, and it was successful. And there's been a lot of interesting conditions attached to that settlement. There was a financial settlement, but as John explained, and this is where this morning comes in, is that there was a set amount of money set aside for the class action but people had to apply for that money. They had to submit an application providing evidence that they had suffered abuse and mistreatment. And only with that evidence could you get money back. And so, of course, because some people either found that process too difficult or they were not accompanied well in that process, not all the money was distributed. There was more than $7 million left over. And that's the really, really sad part of this. So that's how this project came into being. There was this extra money, and the government finally, with pressure, said, okay, we'll release the money if you can submit proposals for projects. And so that was where we got the money for this project. So just to briefly show, Marie and Pat are surrounded there with Marilyn and Jim Dolmage, who were their litigious guardians. And they have been instrumental in all of this work around hearing the stories of institutional survivors. So now what? So the settlement happened in 2013, which involved a formal apology from the government in the legislature. It also involved a promise to keep up the cemetery, which again, I think some of our panelists will speak about when it's their turn. And it also ended up in what the government called the Strategic Investment Fund, which we are calling Investing in Justice, this extra money that we applied for to do some projects to allow institutional survivors to share more about their experiences. That's just a picture of the apology that's attached to a plaque at Huronia.